Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Put it up a little higher with the volume.
Oh, that's above my pay grade. I don't know how to do that. But if you can't hear me, please just let me know. So thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones. To get us in the mood for the topic, I want us all for a second to imagine. Imagine Reston without this community center, this place where we get to gather. Imagine Reston without the plaza, without the fountain, without the public art, without the lake, without all the lakes, without the open space, without the diversity that we enjoy, the community that we enjoy. Imagine Reston without the things that brought you here and the things that keep you here. Now imagine that Reston doesn't exist at all, because it nearly didn't. Except for an improbable chain of events, we wouldn't be sitting here together tonight. So, Chuck and I are going to take you through those events. And Chuck is going to take you way back.
Well, yes, I'm going to take you all the way. Oh, now I'm moving. Look at this. We got all the way up to Bob. That was quick. Thank you. So, we're going to go back to 1647. None of us were here, right? Bob had them. In 1647. Now, you can find, this is really great information that was part of a book called Reston, A New Town in the Old Dominion. And this was published in 1991 by Nan Netherton. And also, they're in front of this wonderful book by this very famous photographer, Charles A. Veatch. There is an outline, a brief history of Reston land in the front of this as well. And I'm just going to take you back to this, because frankly, when you start thinking about Reston, you have to start basically with the land. Reston isn't Reston without the land. And the land was some sort of spectacular piece of property. You're going to find out what happened to this land going all the way back to 1647. Now, how many people know why Virginia is called the Cavalier State? Oh, Walter probably knows. But those of us that are Wahoos, Cavaliers, from the University of Virginia, probably most of them don't know it either. But back in 1647, in the 1640s, there was a major overtaking of the royal house. And King Charles I lost in a battle, a series of battles, lost the war to Oliver Cromwell, who became the first regent king of England. He had no royal blood. And Charles I was beheaded. And Charles II, whose portrait we see here, went into exile along with a group of loyalists. And those loyalists in those days, those that were loyal to Oliver Cromwell were called Roundheads, and those that were loyal to Charles I were called Cavaliers. Well, Charles II in exile granted to 7 loyalists 5.2 million acres of land in Virginia. Now this land went all the way from the headwaters of the Potomac, which includes a lot of what is West Virginia today, to the ocean and everything north, which included this. So here we are. This grant was given in 1647. Of course, it wasn't really legal until Charles II came back, took the throne again, and all of the grants and all the things that he bequeathed while he was in exile actually became law, and these Cavaliers then owned 5.2 million acres. Well, the Cavalier that ended up here in Northern Virginia was Lord Fairfax. And so we had here in 1765 the Great Falls Manor, which was owned by Byron Fairfax, who was also known as the Baron of Cameron. No, there in Cameron Avenue, of course. So it was 12,588 acres at that time, and it was prospected for minerals, including talc, by the way, and it was logged for timber. And then in 1843, Reginald Fairfax used a portion of the 8,600 acre Coleman Run for farming and logging. So he had sold off other property. It's now down to 8,600 acres, and it was farmed and logged. In 1852, a Brit by the name of Benjamin Thornton, who was quite a land speculator, bought the land, the 8,600 acres, and he installed 2 steam-powered saws and a mill, and he began logging and farming and a development in developing the property in earnest. And then a railroad was later put through the middle of the property, and a post office and a general store and a mill was established. So there actually was a little village going on here back in 1852. Well, we all know what happened from 1860 to 1865. Everything went haywire, and we had the Civil War, and both the Union and Confederate troops marched up and down through Northern Virginia and right across the land which we now know as Reston. They tore up all the tracks, burned all the ties, created a general mess all through the property. And so when the property came, when the war was over, by 1886, Benjamin Thornton was in big financial trouble, and he had no choice but to sell the property. And it was sold for $3 an acre. And it was now 6,449 acres. Basically, it was cut in half. And the way this worked was, there were 2 gentlemen. The first one was General William McKee Dunn. And he had a partner by the name of Loring. And that's how we had Loring down at Tyson's Corner area. And they were land speculators, and they also developed Dunloring as a place where you would come to get out of the city and the heat and so forth. So it was sort of a resort at Dunloring. Well, General William McKee Dunn had made a deal to buy the property, which was being sold all in one piece at auction, with none other than Dr. A. Max Whibley. So the 2 of them got together, bought the property, and then later cut it in half, which basically said William McKee Dunn owned everything south of the tracks, and Whibley owned everything north of the tracks, roughly cutting it in half. So now, Mr. Dunn dies. His wife sells the property to Fairfax Lumber Company in 1910. So now we have 3,221 acres owned by Fairfax Lumber. The balance of the property had already been lost because Dr. Whibley, despite all of his wonderful ideas about the town of Whibley, and actually getting a charter in the state of Virginia for the town of Whibley, which is another very long story, which some of you know about, which was revoked not that long ago. Dr. Whibley, right at the turn of the century in 1900, there was a huge recession. Dr. Whibley fell into ill health and ultimately had to sell the property. Well, it ultimately ended up being sold to a fellow by the name of Dr. Hutchison. And Dr. Hutchison ended up buying the property from Dr. Max Whibley and started a dairy farm, a very big dairy farm. And so Dr. Hutchison ran that dairy farm. He cleared 500 acres and had a 200-cow dairy farm and started also cutting lumber and milling lumber, as everyone did throughout the time. Well, Dr. Barber died. In 1924, his estate, Dr. Hutchison died, and his estate was then sold to A. Smith Bowman. So that's all the property north of the tracks, basically. It actually went a little south of the tracks, but let's call it the tracks. Everything north of the tracks got sold to A. Smith Bowman. The Bowmans moved here. They expanded the dairy farming. They started growing more grain. They had cattle, they had horses, and they were having a great time just being good old country boys in the state of Virginia. And then in 1934 came the repeal of Prohibition. And the Bowmans decided that, well, why not build the only legal still in the state of Virginia, which they did do. And the corn and grain were grown for the mash, and barrels were made from the cutting of the timber. And in general, they had a great time with the land north. But interestingly enough, because now the Bowmans own half the property, the other half of the property is still owned by Fairfax Lumber Company. For whatever reason, in 1947, Fairfax Lumber Company decides to sell the property in the Bowmans barn. That put 6,500 acres back together. The Bowmans increased their land holdings to 6,800 acres. And then around 1960 or so, 59-60, they actually sold the entire property, including the distillery, to Left Court Realty Corporation for $19.5 million. Well, the deal fell through. And when the deal fell through, then our history really started.
Nicely done, Chuck. Okay, so we have the land. Now we need the visionary. Because if Bob hadn't been born, and if he hadn't survived at least 4 near-death experiences that I know of, we wouldn't be here tonight. Luckily for us, Bob was born on April 10th, 1914. I have a picture of him here, not too long after that. And Bob cheated death the first time during a family trip to Europe. You can see, oh, I think I have a pointer. I don't know which button. Oh, there. Okay, so this is the family after a harrowing car crash in the Alps in Austria. And here's the family convalescing. We have Bob here. You can see he's got a bandage on his head. His father has a bandage on his head. And his youngest sister, Carol, was really grievously injured, but she's doing all right there. So he survived that first near-death experience. The next one came a few years later during another trip to Europe. Bob and family are I don't know, trekking in the Alps, or I think this is in Switzerland, and Bob falls into a crevasse and is saved by his sister. He said that she helpfully tossed him a cane and he pulled himself out. Now the third one was during his dude ranch years. During college, he would go out to a dude ranch in Arizona, and he was out one day herding cattle, and lightning struck a cow 10 feet away from him. Killed the cow instantly, knocked the horse out from under Bob. But somehow, Bob survived. And the fourth one I just learned about recently was on a surveying flight with James Reston, surveying the land that would be Reston, and they hit a terrible thunderstorm and nearly crashed. So we're pretty lucky that we got this far. We got Bob to at least to 1950, where he came to Reston, and then we got another 51 years. So, without certain events and elements in Bob's upbringing, Reston wouldn't exist, and it certainly wouldn't exist the way it is. It starts with his father, Robert E. Simon Sr. He was also a real estate developer, and Bob would tell me about how he would come home in the evenings, they would sit around the dinner table, and they would talk about the developments that Bob Sr. was working on. And one was Radburn, New Jersey. It was an early attempt at a new town. Ultimately, it wasn't successful, I think, because of the Depression, but certainly that stuck in Bob's head when he was thinking about it. Bob's father bought Carnegie Hall from Andrew Carnegie's widow in 1925. And that would provide the seed money 35 years later to pay for the land that would become Reston. And certainly we can't underestimate the influences of his European travel. We often hear about how he was influenced by the Italian hill towns and his design for Reston and the village centers. Okay, now we've got the land, we've got the visionary, we need the events to happen. So, first, we have to tip the first domino, and for us, that's Robert Moses. He was master builder, New York City, and in the late 50s, he announced plans to develop a rival music center that was going to take income away from Carnegie Hall. It was going to take their main source of revenue, which was the New York Philharmonic. And without the New York Philharmonic, Bob would say they couldn't even pay the light bill. So Bob made an impassioned plea to Robert Moses to forego the development of Lincoln Center. Well, he wasn't successful, and he had to sell Reston, and that would provide. Oh, what did I say? He had to sell Reston. Yeah. So he had to sell Carnegie Hall. So that provided the seed money to pay for 6,750 acres of farmland in Fairfax County. Meanwhile, we had the Bowman Brothers, which Chuck brought up earlier, who were looking to sell their land around their distillery. And as Chuck said, they originally sold it to Left Court Realty, but that fell through. So the Bowman's broker went to New York City looking for another buyer, and he went to see Roger Stevens, who was a big Broadway producer at the time, and would later become chairman of the Kennedy Center here in DC. And Roger Stevens had no interest whatsoever in the land, but he knew somebody who knew somebody who knew Bob. And so the realtor, or the broker, calls up Bob and says, I've got a deal for you. I've got 6,000 acres of beautiful land in Fairfax County. It's situated between DC and Dulles Airport. You know, the airport's there. Well, it wasn't. Bob said he went out to look at it, and it was, you know, bulldozers scratching the land. It wasn't even as far as this picture here. And he said that there were corporations ready to buy plots of land. He told a great story, great enough to get Bob to come and look at the land. Well, he came and he saw that it wasn't quite what the broker had said it was, but he was taken by the beauty of the land, and he could see the possibilities. And lucky for us, he could see those possibilities and decided to take title on the land in 1960. Okay, and Chuck, you're going to talk about population.
On the population side, yeah, I'll tell a story about the population side.
Okay.
So you're actually gonna go back after this, but since that's up there, I'll tell you. We all remember the cows. We know about those guys. And here the Bowmans with their beautiful horses and dogs. They're going out to the hunt, to ride to the hunt. And this is a sign that we had out on 602 coming in off of Route 7, 606 coming off of Route 7, which was a 2-lane road. Route 7 was a 2-lane road. And one of my first jobs when I came to Reston was to go up to Fairfax County and get a sign permit so we could put up this sign. This was 1964. So Fairfax County government wasn't what Fairfax County government is today. Believe me, we were in very, very rural territory here, and Fairfax County was not a very sophisticated place to be doing business. And I showed up looking for the guy to give me a sign permit. And I wandered around in the offices, which weren't very large, over by the old courthouse, and found the guy that handed out sign permits. And I showed him the sign that we wanted to put up, and he kind of scratched his head and he looked at me and he said, "Why are you even asking us? You own all that into the county. Who gives a damn what you put up?" So that's the way Fairfax County was in 1964, at least as far as signs were concerned. So this was our sign. This was very exciting. So this is late. I mean, 665. That's pretty cool. I can't even remember when that might have been. That was probably must have been 66, maybe 1966 or so. So, but we maintain this sign, the Public Relations Department. Peter McCandless, who's walking around here these days, I think was part of the group that had to maintain this sign. So every time, we didn't do it every time somebody moved in, but once a month somebody would go out and fool with the sign and change the numbers. So this sign was up for probably until about 1971 or so before it got taken down. It was right outside the entrance to Lake Fairfax Park.
So we got the land, and that seemed to be kind of the easiest part. Bob found dealing with Fairfax County was not as easy as he'd like. He had to change the existing zoning so that he could incorporate his residential planned community zoning. And he had to push that through Fairfax County Board of Supervisors during a time when there was a good amount of corruption on the board. And Bob steered clear of that corruption, and he had very strict procedures for his staff to make sure there was not even a whiff of impropriety when they were dealing with county people, to make sure there were plenty of people in the room, that there was no chance that anyone would think that he was paying any kind of bribes to get this zoning passed. But he was able to get it passed. And one of the reasons he was because he surrounded himself with the best and the brightest and the most well-connected that he could find. And one of those was Glenn Saunders there in the picture. He was instrumental in dealing with Fairfax County and getting the zoning passed. And over here in the corner, we have Fritz Gutheim, and he managed an aggressive marketing campaign and succeeded in adding Reston to President Kennedy's year 2000 plan, which literally put Reston on the map, and it raised the profile considerably. And then we have people like Carol Rubin and Jane Wilhelm down here, who were in charge of creating community, and they did, and they convinced early pioneers to stay. And Jane told me a story about changing the numbers on the population sign. That was one of her tasks. Now, Reston would not be the community it is today. We wouldn't enjoy the diversity that we do if it weren't for Bob's mandate that Reston be an open community. And it'd be really hard to overestimate how bold this was. It was the early 60s. Virginia was still deep in Jim Crow. There were no fair housing laws, and the strict segregation of neighborhoods just went unchallenged. So this was really bold, but it was non-negotiable for Bob, and it led to some difficulties. He was turned down by 50 banks for building loans, and it really put the enterprise at risk, but it was non-negotiable to him. So in 1964, the financial pressures were mounting, and Bob was looking for outside investors. And he told me he was looking for a godfather. And that came in the form of golf, and Chuck is going to talk more intensely about that.
I also came in 1964, but I was not the partner. No. So I came from the University of Virginia in 1964, came straight to work for Bob, and things were a little tense, but the money had shown up in 1964, and believe it or not, and people still scratch their heads about this, but it's absolutely true, because I saw the minutes of the board meeting where the marketing department of Gulf presented to the board of Gulf Oil Corporation that they could make this loan of $15 million to Bob and secure 28 gas station sites in Reston. It's absolutely true. They sold that bill of goods to the board, along with some other ideas about what a great opportunity it was for commercial development. They also took an option to buy buy up to, I think it's 30% or something, of the company from Bob, as well as being a lender. And it was a 10-year loan at 5.5% accruing. Now here's the problem with that $15 million. That $15 million virtually disappeared because they insisted on having a first trust on the property. There was a $10 million first trust from the Bowmans to Palindrome Corporation, believe it or not, for 10 years, 0 interest. And Gulf insisted on paying it off. That makes no sense to me, but they needed to have a first trust, so that's what they did. So the money came in, 10 million of it immediately went to pay off the Gulf loan, 3 million of it went to pay other loans that were outstanding. So the net result was in a project that even in 1964, you can imagine the infrastructure that was already here and had to continue. $2 million was a drop in the bucket. When I came to work here, and I was hired by Spencer Potter, who was our sales manager and Bob's godson, as a matter of fact, he was appalled when I told him that I had bought a house. I hadn't started work yet, but I was coming back from Charlottesville, and I said I bought a house in Falls Church. He said, "You did what?" I said, "I bought a house." He said, "You know, this isn't a very secure job I'm offering you. You really shouldn't make that kind of commitment." Well, you know, I was local. I was going to buy a house anyway, so it didn't really matter to me, but it shows you what the general attitude was about everybody that worked here. Everybody was excited, everybody was exuberant, but everybody also knew that every month there was somebody with a briefcase taking off to go find money to meet payroll. And Gulf was not the answer. And so in 1965, Gulf finds another person to come in. So now we have an insurance company. It's John Hancock. $21 million from John Hancock. So $21 million now comes in to the kitty, and this is in 1967. And there is now $36 million worth of debt on the property in 1967. Consider that. So if we can go to the next slide, we have the lights. Okay, so here we are, 1967. I'm the sales manager. Things are very, very tight. We need money